Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Hodan Omar and I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, which for those who don't know is a think tank focused on the intersection of data, technology and public policy. Today, our webinar is about how to unlock the private sector's mobility data for social good. We've seen, especially recently, that mobility data, which describes people's movements from one location to another, can help address pressing societal challenges from responding to instances of forced migration, to addressing the pandemic, to even climate change solutions. And much of the novel mobility data researchers and humanitarians want to use come from call records and mobile apps that provide location-based services. Unfortunately, access to novel mobility data is difficult for researchers and humanitarians to obtain access to because it typically rests in the hands of private firms that face significant legal, financial, and practical challenges to sharing this data. Today, I want to explore three main things. What is this novel mobility data and why do we need it? What the challenges to providing and accessing this data are? And finally, the steps that would help increase access to this data. Fortunately, I have a really wonderful set of panelists joining me to discuss this that represent, I think, a variety of important perspectives on this topic. We have Uttara Sivaram, who is Global Head of Privacy and Security in Public Policy at Uber. We have Antti Piirainen, who is the Head of Comms at FinData, the Finnish Health and Social Data Permit Authority. We have Alex Pompey, who is a Research Manager in Meta's Data for Good. And we have Doug Leisure, who is a Senior Data Scientist at the Leverhulme Centre for Demographic Science at the University of Oxford. Hopefully, we'll have Jos Behrens, who is Data Policy Officer at the Center for Humanitarian Data in the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN OCHA, joining us very shortly. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited for this conversation. Just a reminder for everyone who's joining us at home, this program is meant to be interactive and your questions or comments are most welcome. So if you're watching online, you're invited to submit comments via Slido. If you're watching on the Center's website, you can see the link at the bottom of the page to Slido where you can submit the questions. And if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, you should see the link under the video description. So to begin, I kind of want to set the scene a little bit and talk about what mobility data is really, or especially the novel sources of mobility data and why we need it. It seems to me that mobility data can support social good in a number of different ways, whether that be helping to quantitatively understand and communicate trends, forecasting the likelihood of a given event in the future, or examining the possible consequences of different choices and deciding on the best course of action. And I wanted to get some concrete examples of how your teams are supporting the use of mobility data for social good. So perhaps starting with you, Uttara, you could talk a little bit about Uber's kind of perspective on this. I think Uttara might be a little bit frozen, so maybe we'll start with Alex.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, Houghton. Mobility data, as you rightfully stated, can take many different forms and many different applications. And so drawing that link between a particular data set, a particular aggregation over time and space of mobility data, be that at a country or subnational level, if the source is from IP address all the way down to high accuracy GPS data, and then matching that to the potential efficacies will be an ongoing challenge and one that's quite exciting. At Meta, the Data for Good program is at the forefront of this. So we've been doing this since around 2017 when we began providing aggregated mobility data to inform response to wildfires in northern Alberta, Canada. It was sort of an organic effort and then grew legs and has now grown to encompass a variety of humanitarian responses. Also public health crises. COVID-19 really brought to the forefront a lot of new enthusiasm, but also maybe now we're seeing a little bit of the privacy catching up to that enthusiasm, and increasingly seeing the opportunity for this mobility data to inform research on economic recovery or economic stability of crises, and for more existential crises like climate change, and observing broader scale migration trends as this issue continues to affect the planet in increasingly large ways. So the nature of the mobility data itself is also constantly changing, both from a regulatory standpoint, but also from a technology standpoint. And these sorts of conversations with a multi-sectoral approach within research, the public sector, and the private sector are key for us to take advantage and also not lose track of the key privacy issues, which should stay at the forefront of these discussions when considering mobility data.
Thank you. Doug, you're using some really interesting social media data. I'd love for you to kind of chime in here on how you see mobility data, and especially these kind of novel sources.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. I guess the first thing I would want to point out is that mobility data don't necessarily have to mean data about individual people and their specific locations at a specific point in time. So we can make inferences about population level movements from aggregated and anonymized data that are giving information at a population level for a region for specific demographic groups like age or sex. So at the Leverhulme Center for Demographic Science, we're currently involved in work to estimate daily population sizes for specific age and sex groups within Ukraine to support the humanitarian response. And this is based on social media activity of social media users within Ukraine each day. And in the past, we've had collaborators within the Leverhulme Center and elsewhere, such as the Qatar Computing Research Institute, that have used social media data to estimate flows of refugees and migrants from Venezuela in 2018 and 2019, supplementing traditional data sources like household surveys, which are a bit slower to collect. Also estimating migrant populations inside the UK, again, using social media user activity and supplementing that with more traditional data sources like household surveys, such as the labor force survey. And then also geolocated data can be used outside of just estimating movements of populations. A colleague at the Leverhulme Center, Riddhi Kashyap, is leading an effort to map subnational and national digital gender gaps. So this is the difference between male and female internet usage globally. So these geolocated data sets provide really valuable information at frequent time steps that enable this type of research to be done.
Thank you. As you know, you've kind of already talked about these different kind of sources. So I think it's worth asking at this point, how important is it to have these different and complementary data sets that come from different sources in order to make sure that the work that you're doing is as accurate as it can be?
Yeah, so this is a critical point. It's essential to have combinations of data sets. So this helps us do a few things. It helps us to estimate the uncertainty of any inferences that we're making from these types of data sets. So we need kind of external validation data sets from trusted sources. A good example might be if you're trying to use social media user activity to estimate population sizes, you would want to fit that to census-based estimates so that you're adjusting for any inherent biases or data gaps that could exist in these types of novel data sets. So it's critical to have these data combinations.
Thank you. Uttara, I wanted to come back to you and kind of talk about what data sets Uber makes available and how people are using them.
Yeah, and apologies, my internet decided to fail right at the perfect moment, as always. But thank you for the question, Hodan. Yeah, I wanted to just emphasize what Doug says, which is that mobility data in aggregate form is really, really valuable, especially when we're talking about these sort of shared public policy goals. And so just a few examples of how we've sort of supported cities is providing data on the distribution of rides that are occurring in different neighborhoods when cities are trying to understand how connected different neighborhoods are, which areas need more access to public transportation or other mobility options. We can provide data about emissions avoided by shared rides, right? How is that sort of contributing to their reuse and reutilization of existing mobility options, as well as the fraction of trips taken during specific time intervals, like peak commute hours. Again, trying to figure out where private options, other mobility options can step up to sort of assist when public transportation options are less available to or accessible. And so again, those sort of aggregated metrics, I think, are really helpful. They perform sort of the dual purpose of protecting consumer privacy, but also sort of driving and helping assist towards those shared public policy goals. So assisting cities, in this way is really, something that we that is really important and core to our mission.
Thank you, Jos. Welcome. I wanted to ask you, there's clearly a lot of interest around using new types of mobility data, especially in response to the Ukrainian crisis, as we've heard. But just how good are humanitarians at understanding how to use this data effectively in ways that drive real impact?
That's an excellent question. Hold on, I'm so sorry for joining late. My machine failed me, and so I've had to convince a colleague to hand me his machine, which was quite a task. But I'm here now, and he is very angry. So in response to your question, first of all, maybe just a bit of background on who I am and where I come from. So I'm with the Center for Humanitarian Data. We were launched in 2017 as part of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. We have our main offices in The Hague, the Netherlands, but we have quite a distributed team, and our focus is really on improving the use and impact of data in humanitarian response. As part of the United Nations, that also means, given the framing of this panel, I don't come at this discussion in sort of an advisory role to the European Union, but I'm really here to bring the perspective from the UN in our sort of global humanitarian response activities. From that perspective, one use of mobility data that I wanted to highlight is around the work that we do on predictive analytics. So we've tried to gain access to mobility data, and in particular CDRs, in some of our predictive work when it comes to the impact of COVID in what we call humanitarian response plan locations, so locations with an active crisis. In those locations, we've tried to predict the impact of COVID, and we wanted to use some human mobility data for that prediction. But we've had a lot of issues trying to get access to this data. And that's primarily because there is a lack of clarity around the standards for anonymization, the contracts that should be written up to safely transfer such data, and a host of other issues which haven't been resolved and which have led us to not be able to access that data in those situations. When it comes to Ukraine specifically and what's needed to use these data from new data sources, I think you're absolutely right that there is a gap in terms of the capacity and understanding of humanitarians when it comes to using this new type of data. That goes for mobility data, but I think for a lot of sort of non-traditional data that we're now trying to use to strengthen humanitarian response. I think that there's a gap in a number of different ways. So that includes how to ask the right questions of this new data. But then also a point that was raised by Doug earlier, the importance of triangulating this with other data to make sure we're not just relying on mobility data as the only source of information. I think humanitarians don't quite know yet how to properly triangulate this type of information with other data sources. There's a lot of interesting work underway, including by the GovLab at NYU, as well as the World Economic Forum and others who have been working to, I think, prepare both the contracts needed as well as the infrastructure needed to share this type of data, but we're not there yet. And so there's clearly a gap there still. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much. I think that really kind of moves us on to the next part of this discussion that I wanted to have, which is really these challenges and sort of how to address them. And Antti, we've kind of touched on this lack of clarity about what mobility data to share, how to share it, who to share it with. And this point around triangulating the data. And I'm really glad you're here, because in Finland, the government has taken responsibility for making a lot of these decisions when it comes to sharing health and social data. And I think that what you're doing over at FinData is really relevant to this conversation around mobility data. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about the work that FinData is doing, and what lessons you've learned from kind of centralizing a lot of these decision making.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So yeah, basically FinData, we're an permit authority for social welfare and healthcare data when it's used for secondary purposes. So the primary use, of course, is treating the patient. Excuse, my kids are screaming over there. But when it wants to be used for secondary purposes, for example, research or statistics or innovation, then there's always a permit that is needed. And the data is, of course, gathered and generated on a daily basis in the like primary use in hospitals and hospital districts and etc. And we in Finland, we have a lot of national registers with long time historic data that are structured. And previously, that data was used when it was used for secondary purposes. Each of the permits were applied from different data controllers that had the data stored. And around 3 years ago, this new legislation came into effect, which kind of launched FinData as the centralized permit authority. So whenever you need data when it's combined from multiple different controllers, the permit is applied from us, and we'll take care of the compiling and pseudonymizing or aggregating the data, and provide also a secure user environment where the data can be analyzed securely. But of course, healthcare data, any data is, of course, the privacy is an important issue, but perhaps for healthcare data is even more important than for mobility data. And therefore, the permits are always granted for a certain period of time, and they can only be analyzed in this specific environment from where you cannot download the results yourself, but they go through us. So basically, that's how the system works in Finland now, and there's a lot of buzz going on in Europe as well with the European Health Data Space Initiative. But perhaps the lessons what we learned during the 2.5 years we've been operating is that this was a major systemic change for the research environment, since they had their kind of conventions on how to deal and deliver the data, and now when it's a lot more regulated, it has made some kind of challenges to the process for the actual users of the data.
Thank you so much. I wonder, Otara and Alex, obviously we don't have this for, this is not true for mobility data, but I wanted to kind of ask, in the absence of having a kind of centralized authority responsible for deciding, what to share and who to share it with, how do your organizations currently make these decisions? Maybe starting with you, Alex.
Sure. So I don't think we have a playbook that's set in stone. Especially when talking in the context of crises, again, the particular form, nature, and granularity of mobility data should be considered versus the potential efficacy that when it's shared with a humanitarian actor or a government or fully publicly could plausibly be achieved. And so each of those deserve to be considered on their own merits. So, right, the mobility data that might be useful for Ukraine is very different than the mobility data that might be useful for COVID-19 purposes. And the best way to then weigh those is to bring, as I mentioned before, a multi-sectoral approach to quantify as much as possible the potential efficacies for a given use case, define that time and spatial extent to which data would be shared, and then especially then to hone in on the specifics of the data so that the privacy can be specifically measured and quantified, and then distilled down and communicated out as broadly as possible so that users themselves understand the specific risks that are taking place. In most cases, we can materially move those down a lot, but it shouldn't just be taken at our own word. It should be an auditable trace that then is backed up by the results of this engagement, where a layperson could turn to a researcher, an academic, or a civil society organization that has a long history of responding to a given humanitarian crisis or in a particular region. And that sort of validation is much more meaningful than a technical differential privacy scoring in this use case. So I think bringing together the people to talk about very specific data sets, very specific efficacies that could plausibly be achieved, and the very specific privacy protections that will limit the data are crucial.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's really no silver bullet for, just magically anonymizing every data set that might be here. And then that's where communication and conversation with the entity that needs the data is really important, right? To figure out, okay, how do we make sure we can, provide the data that's needed, but not affect the actual utility of the data set. And in order to do that, you really need to understand, okay, how is the data going to be used? Where can we maybe increase noise in certain features of the data so that we can protect privacy? And where do we need to be more precise? And it's just a combination of those factors. And the output is a really bespoke, but also, high utility, just useful data set that can be utilized. But it's never, there's rarely a single approach, rarely a silver bullet. That being said, there isn't a ton of, I would say, legal clarity on this point. And so, having that framework internally, right? Having a really strong sense of principles, right? How do we make these evaluations efficiently within the company that takes into account all these factors, right? Who the requesting entity is, what type of data is being requested, what the features of that data are. Creating that framework internally really helps to just make sure we're being consistent and again, reducing risks to consumers.
Doug, from your researcher perspective, what are your thoughts on this? Because there are kind of principles around providing access to the data, but then from your kind of researcher perspective on guidance around use, and ultimately, you can do research, but there will be some end user, at the end of that, who's going to make decisions based on your research. So I kind of wanted your perspective on this.
Yeah, thank you. I think Alex and Utara have really described nicely kind of the complications that make this difficult. So of course, researchers can benefit from open access to these data sets, and there are very clear use cases that can benefit the public in general from researchers having access to these data sets. But the risk assessments are very context dependent, and the way that data are used appropriately, it really depends on the location and the exact situation where it's being analyzed. And so this creates kind of time lags in making these decisions and requires a lot of resources for data providers to assess each situation individually, which is very difficult. But I'm going to add another layer of complication on that. So there are guidelines and regulations in place, to protect the privacy of individuals. And good examples of this is the General Data Protection Regulation and other legislation intended to protect data privacy. On top of that, there's individual research ethics committees at all research institutions that have their own guidelines and review processes for taking a look at exactly the characteristics of the data being used and what data those are going to be combined with, and how the analysis will derive new data sets that may have their own risk associated with them. And so it's not just the data being shared, it's the data that are being derived from them and being able to handle those and distribute those data sets responsibly. And so it's critical that there are protections in place. And there's this trade-off between publicly acceptable privacy protections versus the speed with which researchers can access these data sets to benefit society. And I think simplifying and clarifying risks to data providers and also risks to research institutions who are using these data is the key to making that happen more smoothly and faster.
Thanks. Jos, UN OCHA has done a lot around data responsibility for humanitarians and humanitarian groups. So can you speak a little bit about that work that you're doing, what data responsibility means to you, and how the thinking has kind of developed over time?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Hodan. And indeed, as you say, there's been quite a bit of work around this topic of data responsibility within the humanitarian sector, which maybe is not surprising because humanitarian response by its nature is a very principled and sort of ethics-based profession, right? The humanitarian principles, impartiality, neutrality, independence, humanity, right? All of these are really at the very foundation of what we do as humanitarians. We try to apply that in the way we manage data as well. And so we've been working on this concept with a number of other stakeholders in the space, this concept of data responsibility, which we define as the safe, ethical, and effective management of data in operational response. So by listing these three, right, safe, ethical, and effective, you can tell that this is not just focused on limiting and protecting the use of data, but also on ensuring that data is used when it can be used responsibly. So really trying to maximize the potential of data. So it's really about this balance, right, of these two. The key reference document here is the Interagency Standing Committee's operational guidance on data responsibility in humanitarian action that was released in February of last year. And it's really the first document of its kind, which applies across the humanitarian sector and sets out both the sort of key concepts, principles, as well as actions to take in humanitarian response in order to safeguard this data responsibility. And an example of such an action is something that we've been supporting our Ukraine office on over the past month and a half or so, which is the development of what we call a data and information sensitivity classification. So this is a document that, sort of to Doug's earlier point on being context sensitive, it's a document that sets out 4 different levels of data sensitivity and then lists the data and information types that fall into those categories. So from low or no to medium sensitive, high sensitivity, all the way to severe. So that's the most sensitive data, such as personal or personally identifiable information. So for those 4 categories, it then sets out how that data should be shared. So can it be made publicly available? And if so, which platform should be used? Or if it should be more protected, how then should it be encrypted, for example? So that's what this document sets out. And that's one of the, or part of the actions contained in the IASC operational guidance. And there's a lot more actions there, so I can drop in the link into the chat so that people can take a look at the operational guidance if they're interested. Thanks.
Thanks. It seems like overcoming a lot of these barriers, especially when it comes to de-anonymizing data, it seems like it requires a lot of costly tools. Do you think that, firstly, I think we should just dive into what these tools are, how the resources that they take. So maybe Alex, you could start with what does it take to really de-anonymize mobility data?
Sure. So there's luckily a lot of guidance from the research community that helps us advance this, and we're not forging ahead on our own in the private sector. And there's also increasingly a tremendous amount of support from standard setting agencies in a variety of policy environments that are bringing us up to speed, similar to how maybe 10 or 15 years ago, encryption standards weren't well recognized, but now have become like pretty formative and pretty referenceable. The main costs, I'd say, were not, or I mean, maybe at the scale of Meta and Uber aren't like on the computation side. There's two pieces, I think. The first would be like the risk component, which is to what extent are we confident that a given privacy protection? So 5 years ago, or more than 5 years ago, it was already very clear from work by Zhu et al. And using their trajectory recovery from ASH methods that just simply aggregating mobility data does materially very little to remove re-identification risk for individuals. You basically have fingerprints still sitting within those data sets. And the majority of mobility data providers, I think, are working to do a better job, but COVID-19 has certainly exposed that there's a tremendous amount of even just simply like, oh, we've scrubbed PII from this individual level trace, and this is just a collapse of privacy. So we're still just catching up with what the research guidance is showing. And when companies see those examples from a leadership level, et cetera, the risk aversion is very high because we don't want to be associated with that type of practice that we see within the technology sector. We want to be vanguards of advancing it. The second piece, I think, which is a bit more inherent to the private sector, is there's a ton of different mobility data sets we might be able to build, a ton of different crisis settings or social impact sectors that we could be building towards helping. But which one will have the most impact is the hardest thing to quantify. And this is kind of the resource question, which is pretty inherent to most private sector settings I've seen. Is like, okay, you're working on that. That sounds great. But if you were working on that, could you be doing 100x or 1000x or good? And being able to answer that question with some degree of scientific certainty is actually the larger piece than the economic opportunity costs, at least with the infrastructure at the level of Meta and Uber, where those computational costs are pretty immaterial.
Uchara, I'd love your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've found is that there seems to not necessarily be a common understanding of the risks associated with mobility data, and there's a lot of literature out there. The synthesis of that literature can be done in many different ways, and that's kind of what we've run into. We've tried to contribute to that literature by supporting research into different k-anonymity thresholds for trip data, right? And figuring out, what that threshold should be when we're, sharing data sets and making them publicly available. And what we found, again, is that, there isn't a single threshold. Things like geographic density are a really important factor. Even trip density. How many people are taking trips from one sort of remote suburb to another remote suburb? Not a lot. And so that threshold, maybe between two areas that are a little bit more remote, might be quite high versus sort of, traveling within a city where you have a lot of trips, a lot of people, the threshold can be lower. So creating sort of a dynamic threshold in that way, creating these flexible data sets that, again, at the end of the day, we want them to be as high utility as possible. That is really difficult and at least for now, takes a lot of manual effort, right? It takes a lot of judgment. It takes, folks looking at the results and trying to minimize data loss, trying to, make sure that those thresholds make sense for what the recipient wants to do with the data. So I would say there's automation, but there are also just a lot of human and manual costs there. But other techniques like hashing identifiers, right? We're not just talking about GPS or, whatever other, format of location data. It's timestamps. It's, license plates, right? Like all of that information really needs to be protected, hashed wherever possible, so that the whole package is secure, not just, individual fields. And again, that takes judgment, that takes, work, that, it takes some effort. And so those are the kinds of things we think about.
Antti, given thin data bears a lot of the costs, it seems, of providing these resources that's needed to make this data available and shareable and usable, pre-fin data and post-fin data, have you seen that maybe smaller organizations are more willing, or given that this is mandated, that they are better able to share?
That's a really good question, but it's hard to answer since we don't really have data, pre-fin data, of how much the data was utilized, like per data controller. But what can be said is that I think the trend is now that the permits we grant tend to have a lot more data set combined than previously, since they are now available from one location from FinData. But it's really difficult to. I wish we had some data from before, but Doug mentioned the open access data, and of course in Finland there's a lot of open access healthcare data as well, which is totally aggregated. So we're dealing with the kind of individual level pseudonymized personal data most of the time. So the data is utilized in kind of multiple ways as well.
Do you think that the template for fin data could ever be kind of expanded to include mobility data? Would that ever be, let's say that there was an act to say, Finland is also going to share or kind of get access to mobility data. Would that be very easy? Would it be very hard?
Sure, I think it could be. I wouldn't say it would be easy, but if kind of depends on the systems where the data is generated as well, because healthcare data is generated in different kind of computing systems, which then are not perhaps always harmonizable. So it makes a lot of more work to work on the data that it could be analyzed. But yeah, why wouldn't it be? Although, yeah. So.
If anywhere, it seems like Finland would be a good place to start.
Yeah. Our goal is to streamline and secure the use of healthcare and social welfare data. So I guess there could be another. Although I'm not sure if we, yeah, maybe it could be an authority to do that as well.
Given this is a kind of, I'd pose this to Utara and Alex. What impact does mandatory, fin data kind of, it's they can mandate that organizations share this data. I wondered what impact mandatory versus voluntary data sharing when it comes to mobility data has on kind of private companies. Maybe Utara?
Sure. I mean, I can maybe speak generally. I think, of course, the mandatory requirements need to get prioritized within an organization, right? And so, just given, there's a single set of resources, if we are prioritizing the mandatory requirements, generally there's less bandwidth, less resources for academic partnerships, other sort of research projects, other sort of voluntary opportunities to sort of work and make partnerships with, with other organizations. And so that's just something that we have to be mindful of. And I, hope it makes it into the larger discussion of sort of that mandatory versus voluntary structure and what makes the most sense. I think that, it's a shame when we're sort of, required to share these, detailed large data sets that don't really go towards anything, right? That don't help with anything. And that takes a massive amount of effort to produce and QA and clean and send that data. So to the extent that we can make sure that, for whatever data sharing arrangement we come to, that the research questions are specific, tailored, that it's a conversation, I think that sort of would be ideal.
Yeah, I largely echo that. I think I work on a voluntary data sharing program. Data for Good is voluntary, and it's similar. Mandatory data requests go to a very different channel. I think kind of the ideal future that we can imagine is that it isn't a binary, that there's only mandatory data responsiveness or voluntary data sharing when it comes to mobility data. The voluntary data sharing, I think, is the better place to bring together the multitude of stakeholders, to be a bit more experimental, to weigh the privacy risks versus the efficacy, and really push at the front of the spear to drive things forward. And then once there's either a collection of case studies that have demonstrated and validated the efficacy, then it begins to move into the realm where that could be considered mandatory. But again, I think when we think about mobility data, the scale of the company that's holding it and the ability to absorb either mandatory versus voluntary data sharing is very different. So I don't want to come across as sitting in this very ivory tower with Meta's resources. So we'd want to consider across the industry of both the data providers and also the ability to consume the data and turn that into impact. At the end of the day, we're all trying to translate this very abstract thing, a type of mobility data, into something like lives being saved. And if that's strictly being done, I think only from a mandatory or only from a voluntary standpoint, we're going to miss out on and really advancing that potential in the long run.
Thanks. I want to turn to some of the audience questions. Jos, one of the questions we had was to address the implications with respect to data privacy protection regulations. So, the impact of GDPR on the and kind of other data protection regulations. What impact does that have in the work that you do? And also, I know that data privacy and the laws around them differ, across countries. How does that impact you, especially given that you're working in, the response countries might have very different protections than, Europe or America?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question, Hodon. I'll try and answer it as much as I can from sort of my position. The sort of special thing about the GDPR and its applicability to our work is that as a UN entity, due to our privileges and immunities, the GDPR does not apply directly to our work, which means that we mainly interface with the GDPR through our partners who are based in Europe, and with whom we need to collaborate, right? So that's how we see how GDPR has affected the work of our partners in other areas across the world. And we've certainly seen an impact there. So when we work with partners that have an office in Europe, even if that is in a country that is far outside of the EU, the GDPR will come up as a consideration with regard to the management of personal data. So that's what I'll say about that. So definitely we've seen a significant impact of GDPR outside of the EU in the humanitarian response context that we serve.
Thanks. One of the other questions was whether there were good examples of mobile network operators providing call detail records for particular humanitarian responses. And Doug, I know there have been a lot over the years. Orange, Telefonica, many different examples. I wondered if there are, is it easier to get access or harder to get access to call detail records? In your work as well, what is how much do you use CDR data versus these more novel sources?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In my work, I haven't used CDR data. In my previous position, which is at the World Pop Research Group at the University of Southampton, there were a number of researchers using CDR data for a range of applications, humanitarian response and health applications. I know that it's very difficult to access those data sets. And this is kind of the key barrier is it just takes a lot of time to negotiate access and safeguard privacy protections for those data. But in cases where it can be accessed, it's hugely valuable. And this can be a critical source of information for putting resources for humanitarian response, crisis response into the right place. The problem is that the pace of humanitarian response is often much faster than the pace of being able to access those data sets. And so you need pre-planning to establish the partnerships necessary to access those data, so that when they're needed, the data access arrangements are already in place. But this is a huge challenge.
Could you also maybe speak to, how long you need that for kind of sustained access? How important is sustained access for your work?
Yeah, it's very important. And this gets at several of the points that have been raised in the conversation today. So thinking about institutional partnerships that are long-term, where there are very clear data sharing agreements in place, so that everyone understands what the risks are and who's responsible for various aspects, can help facilitate long-term partnerships and data sharing, so that it's possible for researchers to develop methods before the crisis happens. And when we're thinking about how do we take these novel data sources and combine them with more traditional data sources to better account for uncertainties and biases in these data sets, it's very challenging to do that on the timescale of a humanitarian response. And the more that progress that we can make to establish those partnerships in advance and have long-term agreements in place, the better we'll be able to develop the methods that are needed, so that when the crisis does happen, we can respond immediately. And we're not scrambling to try to develop methods with the data that we have available at that moment.
Thanks. Another one of the questions that maybe Otaro or Alex might want to chime in on is, building on the mandatory data sharing question, do you see the Data Act as a good legislative proposal to increase the use of mobility data, whether that be B2B, business to business, or business to government?
Alex, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll admit I'm more of an expert on the data side than the policy side. So I'll be brief in describing that I think that there is still tremendous untapped potential, but also a lot of hype around aggregated mobility data for social impact. And so if a proposed legislation advances discussion that both identifies the specific problems we're trying to address, the stakeholders that would be receiving particular types of data, and especially the nature of the mobility data, CDR versus IP address versus location versus inferences that are derived from totally different data sources. Anything that's driving us to be more specific on both the efficacy and the data at play allows us to really be specific about the privacy, and that's where good legislature will emerge from.
Yeah, I think specificity is the key word here. I think in the Data Act, there are specific mentions of data for sort of public emergencies and exceptional needs, which can be defined in so many different ways. And so the more we can get specific about what types of needs and what types of data could serve those needs, the better. And sometimes that, we just need more use cases, right? We need more examples of situations where data has actually been effective in driving real outcomes, and then that can be playbooked, right? And even maybe encoded in acts like the Data Act, right? Because we have a track record of that data being useful. But in the absence of that, I think for a lot of companies reading the Data Act, there's just a lot of uncertainty about what that means, what that means for them, and what that means for the types of data that they'd need to sort of produce on an ongoing basis.
Thanks. One other question was, what would you expect from a common European mobility data space, which aims to provide technical and governance building blocks to facilitate data sharing? And to flesh this out a little bit, we did actually see, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Commission kind of asked 17 mobile network operators that covered 22 EU member states and Norway to transfer mobility data from call detail records. And it was, really successful. It was something that they were able to pull together quite quickly. Could there be, firstly, do you think this could work for other types of mobility data, and what might that need from your perspective? I think you all have quite varied perspectives. So maybe, Doug, you could start with kind of your researcher kind of hat.
Sure. I mean, I think the data standardization is the challenge there. So centralizing these data sets is difficult because each data set has its own characteristics, and putting those together in a way that's coherent so they can be used together effectively is a real challenge. So the data standardization part of that, but I mean, I think Antti could probably speak more to this, that the infrastructure that's needed to be able to then provide secure access and review proposals to access that, and kind of enforce the privacy guidelines that are needed to do that well is not a trivial task.
Yeah, maybe Antti, you could speak to the kind of challenges of these centralized mobility spaces.
Yeah, sure. I'm not really an expert on mobility data, but Doug has an important point of the data standardization and descriptions as well. We're struggling with that in Finland as well to kind of how to motivate the data controllers to even describe their data sets in a way that researchers can browse a kind of catalog and see what kind of data is available from where, and what are the characteristics of each data set. So I would say that if this kind of centralization would work when it also includes the kind of polishing of the data and standards.
Thanks. Jos, do you have any thoughts on this? Oh, sorry, Tara, please.
I was just going to add, I see a lot of discussion around the benefits of near real-time or real-time data and APIs in common data spaces, and I can definitely see the sort of the reason for this, but I would also just underscore the challenge of applying all of these privacy techniques in near real-time or real-time to mobility data. It's just unbelievably difficult, and that sort of the real-time transmission adds additional privacy risks that also need to be mitigated, right? Privacy or even personal security risks. And so as we continue to think about the type of data sharing, right? Whether it's data sets, whether it's APIs, those carry other risks and other considerations worth thinking about. Sorry to interrupt.
Thanks.
No, great to get that sort of additional comment, and completely agree that it's a whole different ballgame, right? When we start to speaking about APIs and real-time data sharing. I mean, I would just really try and reinforce the point that what we need here, I think, is good examples, both in terms of use cases, so where the sharing and use of this data has created impact, as well as examples of what good partnerships look like. And I think one of those is the partnership that we've had with Meta, sharing their mobility or population density maps through our data sharing platform, so the Humanitarian Data Exchange. They've been doing that for quite some time now, and it's one of the most popular sources of data on our platform, which also goes to show that there's a lot of interest in how this in how this data can be used. But I think, yeah, we need more investment in sort of showing what that type of arrangement, the data sharing, and then the use of that data looks like.
Thanks. We had one question on satellites data, and I wondered, Doug, if you'd, one of the various types of mobility data is satellite imagery. I wondered if you'd worked with this at all, and if there are kind of if that's relevant to this kind of conversation.
Yeah, I think it could be. So satellite data, I have worked with in the past, but not quite in the context of population mobility. Satellite imagery provides a snapshot in time, and it is a key data source, primarily for mapping buildings and changes in density of buildings, and this obviously relates to population densities. There are all kinds of initiatives that I haven't personally been involved with, such as quantifying numbers of cars, and things like that I think could relate to mobility specifically. But I haven't myself worked on those issues, so I wouldn't want to speak without more knowledge there.
I can just say, when we think about standards as applied to satellite imagery, notions such as consent or standard contractual causes just quickly fall apart. There's no mechanism on Earth by which you're going to be able to receive universal consent. And even the act of doing so, if you even had an army of people on the ground to go door to door, this would involve minors and things. So I think it is an interesting place to imagine where, again, policy will need to be specific to the sources of data and the way it's aggregated and the uses and the receivers of that data, and that one size fits all approaches will not work, because this concept of mobility really is an abstraction of location as it is unto itself, and even the way that Meta collects GPS data from users will be very different from Uber's. And so the ability to have both a space to explore and experiment in voluntary data sharing mechanisms to inform the more the involuntary or required, I think will be absolutely critical as we ethically explore a nascent space for social impact. I think you're muted, Hoshin.
Thanks, and it's the final question. I almost got through the whole thing. So just to kind of follow up, we've been talking about, the need for guidance, but also really thinking about specificity. And I think there's always going to be some risks that are hard to foresee and just hard to get ahead of. For instance, we saw that Google had to make the decision to turn off that live traffic feature in Ukraine on Google Maps once it was revealed that this data could be used for military decisions. Very hard to kind of foresee this. Is it, how do you think about these sorts of decisions when you need to make the decision very, very quickly? Should it be the responsibility of companies to come up with this, or should there be, can policy be quick enough to deal with these sorts of things? What are your thoughts on this balance? It's kind of an open question, but maybe Doug, I see you nodding, so I'll start with you.
I think this is a very, very good point and difficult question. I think the best answer is probably that everybody has a role to play here. So governments, data providers, research institutions, publishers, all have a role to play, and looking at these issues and risks and potential benefits of analyzing data and releasing them. It takes various perspectives to see the value and the risks from different angles. And so I think I would just say that it needs to be an open conversation. And I think when we're talking about data centralization specifically, that doesn't mean that everyone else is relieved of responsibility from assessing these issues. And I think we all kind of have a role to play in acting responsibly and sharing information openly.
Yeah, so if we can, when we imagine in these types of situations where decisions need to be made quickly, the amount of stakeholders involved in signing off on such a decision will exponentially increase the amount of time required to make that decision. And even in the inverse of the Google scenario you described, let's imagine that there was data that would be very useful for responding to the Ukraine crisis, but it's known that it had been withheld, and thus is there a mechanism for governments, humanitarians, or researchers to request it? Both of those scenarios require the strength of relationships and the diversity of those edges in the network, and the shared responsibility in making those decisions for everyone to feel comfortable moving quickly. And so it's not super glamorous, but it is just developing and trusting and building the networks of experts who can weigh in and advancing these conversations and pointing to specific use cases is the quickest way to build community, because everyone gravitates towards this social impact. We all have the same shared goal in these situations. It's just, are we erring on the side of caution? Was something missed? And is there a quick way to quickly, reach out to someone or work with, or a degree removed from that channel to instigate the conversation? And so, yeah, I don't think it's really anything novel, new, We just need to push and try a little bit harder, and especially establish the trust and relationships.
And I would say, just if I can still quickly come in on that point specific to Ukraine and the mobility data there, I would add the point that if we're unsure about the implications of releasing this type of data, we should always err on the side of caution, right? So part of the humanitarian principles is really this concept of do no harm. And so when in doubt, do not share this data, even if you know that it could have a positive impact, right? So that's the point I would add there. And actually in Ukraine, what we did is in the sensitivity classification that I mentioned, mobility data is listed as severe sensitivity, so the highest level of sensitivity, which means that it's really only to be shared with very limited number of partners, really to be treated very, very securely. Again, out of this concept of do no harm. And I really appreciated Doug's point about this taking a number of stakeholders to weigh in on this type of decision making. And I would just flag that in a week from now, the Disaster Mobility Data Network is releasing a white paper on the use of mobility data in public health emergencies. And that includes some of this decision making process around the sensitivity of data. So be on the lookout for that one. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone. We have officially come to an hour. So I'd like to thank you all so much for a really interesting conversation. I learned a lot. And I thank you very much for your varied and really important perspectives. Thanks to everyone else for their great questions at home and for joining us. Thank you very much.